It's 11 a.m., so we'll start in interest of time. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us in our first Ramadan webinar. We wish all of you who celebrate the sacred month, Ramadan Kareem. We hope this month is giving you the space to nurture and heal your souls with love, compassion, and kindness. My name is Sarah Marsso, and I will be your moderator during today's exciting feminist conversation for Qur'anic justice, beauty, and spiritual care. I coordinate Musawah's knowledge building activities, and I'm thrilled to be hosting this session today with the groundbreaking feminist scholars, Omaima Abou-Bakr, Asma Lamrabet, and Mulki Al-Sharmani. Our speakers will address 4 sets of questions. First, they will share with us their experience of engaging with tafsir from a gender perspective. They will introduce us to their new holistic interpretive methodology and reflect on their relationship to the Quranic text. And finally, they will explore the different ways in which the Quran gives us the path towards healing. Before we start, I have a few housekeeping items to cover about this presentation. Due to the overwhelming response, we decided to live stream this webinar on Facebook. Participants joining us on Zoom will be able to ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If we don't get to your question during today's webinar, please follow up with us via email afterward. Unfortunately, we won't be able to take questions from those viewing this webinar on Facebook. Please do not use the chat function to ask questions. Please only use it if you are experiencing technical difficulties and one of our team members will be there to assist you. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send you the link to the webinar recording, including all the relevant links shared during this event. Now we can begin. The month of Ramadan is often known for its fasting ritual, and less for the celebration of the Quran, which was revealed during this holy month, the 27th night or one of the odd nights after the 21st. Muslims believe that the Quran is God's speech sent upon the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ through the angel Gabriel in the 7th century. This happened during his seclusion in the cave of Hira on a mountain near Mecca in Saudi Arabia. The Quran is a living text that holds different names, such as Nur, which means light, Huda, which means guidance, Tanzil, which means sent down with an idea of movement, Dhikr, which means reminder. All these names and many others reflect the multidimensional aspects of this text that is both a source of guidance, of healing, but also calling for reflection and conversation. The first revelation was a dreadful experience for the Prophet, who sought refuge in the arms of his wife Khadija. A prophetic experience that shows that the divine word holds deeper meaning. And if I quote Khalid Abul Fadl, we can never dare think that we do in fact understand. The world is going through a watershed moment, one that pushes us to reflect individually and collectively about the meanings of life. Many of us are experiencing profound feelings of anxiety, fear, and insecurity, and we are seeking sources of comfort and hope. In times of crisis, we find contentment in the continuous remembrance of the presence of the divine, its presence in nature, its presence in hardship, in joys, in others, and in ourselves. This remembrance, this dhikr, can happen in our fasting, in our prayers, in all sorts of meditation, but also in the reasoning with the Quran, this idea of tadabbur. How can we find out this light in midst of darkness? How can the ethical teachings of the Quran help us to pursue a life based on justice, beauty, compassion, and harmony for individuals and communities? To discuss this, we are privileged to have with us 3 feminist scholars. Omaima Abou-Bakr, who is a professor of English and comparative literature at Cairo University. She co-founded the Women and Memory Forum and is a member of the Musawah Knowledge Building Research Team. She is the author of numerous publications on mysticism, theology, and gender issues in Islamic discourse. Asma Lamrabet is a hematologist and a writer. She's a founding member of the Fatima Mernissi Chair at Mohammed V University in Rabat, a member of the Moroccan National Committee on Education and Culture, and a member of the Scientific Committee of the Dries Ben Zikri National Institute for Human Rights. She authored several books and articles on women and Islam. Mulki Al-Sharmani is Associate Professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Helsinki. She's also a member of the Knowledge Building Working Group at Musawah. She is the author of numerous publications on gender issues, family law, and Islamic legal tradition. And you can access their full bios in our website. So without any further ado, let's embark on our quest with our honor guest speakers. Omaima, Asma, and Mulki, you are working together as part of Musawah's Knowledge Building Research Initiative. And this project is one of the very few spaces in which feminist scholars are invited to come together to read, reflect on, and interpret the Quran. Omaima, could you please share with us what has brought you to this place where you decided to engage in tafsir and own that process of reading the Quran from a gender perspective?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Sarah and friends at Musawah for hosting this event and inviting us to participate. As you were saying, Sarah, in your introductory comments, you know, the Quran is, we're so lucky that it's God's direct speech to us. Needless to say, it's Muslims' foundational source and referential text. We seek guidance from it in all aspects of our life. For me personally, when you ask about the tafsir or interpretation, I've always been interested in hermeneutics as a critical theory in general, in that aspect of textual interpretation, in tafsir, in the tafsir literature, the Quranic commentaries specifically. And I always think to myself that this is where it all started before it got complicated. Hermeneutics or tafsir or interpretation specifically sparks that kind of deep reflection, the tadabbur, the deep reflection that is incumbent upon all Muslims. It's a duty and a right to seek that direct engagement with God's text or God's words or God's speech to us. And for women specifically, for Muslimat, for women Muslims, it's all the more important to seek that direct experience with the Quran, with the text, with that independent quest for justice, for beauty. And I say independent because independent from decades and centuries of patriarchal intercession, patriarchal mediation in that kind of understanding. And that's what we meant by that's what we all here and in our work mean by that feminist lens, that feminist approach. You're looking for that egalitarian ethic that we believe is so much part of the core message of the Quran that has been missed by decades and centuries of male interpreters, particularly when it comes to gender and to gender relations. The Quran to me is a living entity that I have to meet halfway, so to speak. Just as for all Muslims and for all believers, the Quran is a text that guides, that enriches, that gives light. The believer also has to have an innate fitri, an innate moral sense, an innate love of that revelation, and you meet the Quran halfway. So you bring that moral sense, you bring that quest for justice and beauty and egalitarianism to the text as well, to be able to see it as it is, or as God intended for humanity.
Thank you, Omaima. This is enlightening. Thank you for reminding us that it is our prerogative, our duty, and our right to engage in this Quranic process of meaning making, which for the past centuries has been dominated by men, and in particular by patriarchal voices. Asma, you've been working on developing an emancipatory reading of the Quran. Could you please tell us why is it necessary for women to engage with this kind of readings? Asma, we can't hear you. Your mic is muted.
And now? Yes.
Yes.
So, Bismillah, salam to everyone. First of all, thanks to Musawah for organizing this beautiful event. For your question, you know, Sarah, yes, it's necessary and important to engage with this reading because this is all about knowledge, and knowledge is power everywhere, and especially in religion, you know, where it represents the sacred power. So if you don't have knowledge, you can think or choose for yourself. And even if we had during a long time in the Islamic civilization, many Muslim women as alimat, they have always been marginalized by the patriarchal mentality, and very few of them were engaging with tafsir, you know, with commentary of the Quran. So there are only men who, for centuries, have always had access to religious knowledge. So they had the sacred power, which is also a political power. and it's the same, you know, an eternal link between religion, patriarchy, and political despotism. For my own experience, personally, it was for me a big and deep challenge. You know, I came from a religious and traditional society and family, and at the same time, my generation was facing modernity with its new concept as gender equality, emancipation, freedom, and it was we had between modernity and our traditions. You know, so for the Islamic tradition. Modernity, especially for women's emancipation, is absolutely incompatible with Islam. And for modernity, religion is the symbol of women oppression. So for the Islamic course, if you want to be you know, a good Muslim, you have to accept everything. To be ta'a, you know, the famous ta'a, famous theological concept, without asking, you know, any question, because it's goodwill. So goodwill. So for us as women, full choose to make, but really personally, I didn't want to give up, and I just wanted to be the both, you know, modern and Muslim woman. So I decided in the beginning of my quest of spirituality that I have to work by myself and for myself. I didn't want for someone to tell me what is halal and what is haram. And I decided to do my own research to see what does the Quran say and what it doesn't say. It was a long journey, you know, of struggling during like 20 years ago now. And I'm still struggling because knowledge, as the Quran said, it's like an ocean without limits. And you need, you know, a huge capacity of endurance, and especially because you are a woman. So you will never really know what are religious rights and responsibilities as a human being, as a woman liberated by God without Islamic and Quranic knowledge. For a long time, the theological patriarchal system have used this ignorance and our ignorance in this field to impose us their whatever they choice, but to recover this Islamic and Quranic knowledge from our context and from our perspective as women, who capacity of reasoning as given to us by God. So I will finish with this image when you can see a woman inside a blocked cage, but they forget the key inside, and the Quran is the key.
Thank you, Asma. A very powerful image that speaks by itself. And as you've rightly pointed out, we can only do the work by ourselves. And it's a long and very difficult quest for knowledge that is particularly necessary for women and those who are marginalized, who have been silenced for so long. Mulki, what was the most inspiring aspect of this unique collaboration with Omaima and Asma? How empowering this was?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum to all of you. Thank you for your interest. Thank you, Sarah and Musawah, for organizing this. Happy to be in this sohbah, in this company. To answer this question, Sarah, I think there's a lot inspiring and empowering about working with Omaima and Asma. And I would say it's because we share two quests. One is a spiritual quest, a faith-based quest. We share a faith-based position, believing that this Quran is sacred, that it's meaningful, and that it's relevant to us. Also a faith-based belief that God has entrusted us with the amana, with the obligation to seek knowledge. You know, those who know and those who don't know are the same, as the Quran tells us, and to do justice, in Allah ya'murukum bil adl wal ihsan, and to do the good and the beautiful. So that's on the spiritual quest. But I also share with them, this is very much an intellectual quest. This intellectual quest has a number of dimensions. One is to study the Quran and specifically focus on and try to learn and make explicit its ethical worldview. what is it teaching us ethically? What are its central ethical messages, and how are these ethical messages important for how we drive norms from the Quran and from the tradition that was produced around the Quran? And the second dimension to that intellectual quest is engaging with the Islamic interpretive tradition, in this case the tafsir, with humility, with seriousness that this rich tradition deserves, but also with rigor and also with a very critical thinking approach, and focusing on two questions that are interconnected. The question of methodology: how did certain interpretations become authoritative, and specifically in regard to the question of gender. And this intellectual quest, we're also adopting an integrated approach. It's part of a larger quest where a group of Muslim women and men are working with us through a Musawah-led research project in collaboration with a number of universities, where we also engage with other genres in the interpretive tradition, like the usul al-fiqh, like the fiqh, like Sufism, like Muslim family laws, and most of all, also the lived realities of women and men in different parts of the world. And the larger questions that we're speaking to, or you could say assumptions that we're questioning through our intellectual quest, is this idea that religion and sacred text are irredeemably patriarchal, and that there's no space in them for justice. We are questioning that through a very rigorous intellectual quest, inquiry. We're also questioning this idea that faith-based inquiry cannot be rigorous, cannot be epistemologically meaningful, as well as ethically important. So these are the key things that I find, and I'm very privileged to be working with Omaima and Asma and to learn from them, as well as other very outstanding women scholars through which whom we get to collaborate in this project and the previous one that we're building on. And we'll get you, I hope we'll get a chance to talk about the work of these women as well, as we discussed today. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Mulki. And what a beautiful way to see this intellectual and spiritual quest as an amana from God, this responsibility. Your work is really spiritually uplifting, and you're planting the seeds for a 3-woman voices holistic exegesis of the Quran. And we're thrilled to be able to discuss this with you today. Omaima, can you please share with us what are the main gaps that you identified in the exegetical tradition?
Yes. Of course, the exegetical tradition, first of all, the lack or the absence of a consistent, comprehensive, ethical outlook on the Quran as a whole, that would govern all interpretations, that would govern all surahs, all verses. You know, there is not enough emphasis on every individual verse or surah. There's not enough emphasis on what is the divine intent of edification. What does God want to teach us here from this verse, from that, from this surah, from this instance? What is the moral that we can derive, even behind historical verses that are rooted in a specific historical occasion? There's still a moral, there's still an edifying moral behind the verses. And what's the general ethic, the egalitarian and other kind of Quranic ethics? How does that apply to the interpretation? That we don't see that a lot, or methodically or consistently to govern the exegete's outlook. That's the first thing. That's the first thing that you notice when you examine that tradition. And secondly, and as a result, of course, most of the classical commentaries, I'm talking about the genre of the Quranic commentaries, right? Not the theoretical works of philosophy or ethics, but in terms of the overall tafsir, the Quranic tafsir, exegetes, of course, naturally went surah by surah, verse by verse, piecemeal, bit by bit, to explicate and to comment and to deduce rulings from as much as possible from the verses, but rarely with deeper connections between the verses or between the surahs in ethical meaning or in discourse or in justice discourses, for instance. Not etymologically and not philologically. The exegetes were very clever, of course, in examining the language of the Quran, the Arabic language of the Quran, the etymological roots of particular words. They would make that connection between, verses, but not in the ethical, not ethical connections. Yani if you, for instance, if you have a verse, one or two or three verses that talk about the basic equality of human beings in creation and in reward and in punishment, that should be connected to other specific verses on gender, on orphans, on women, on marriage, on divorce, to make that connection in a discourse, in a very specific egalitarian discourse. And that's what all Muslim feminists, and that's what Muslim feminist scholars have been, calling for decades, by the way. It's not just starting today. Look at the ethics and the spirit of the egalitarian ethics of the Quran and make that connection. Don't ignore the equality verses. For instance, the three famous, very well-known equality verses in the Quran. There's no time to go into them now. You look at the exegetical tradition, and they didn't inspire them to talk about how revolutionary these equality verses, these gender equality verses were. They didn't attract their hermeneutical attention, so to speak. Anyway, so that's the second point. A third point, or a natural result of that, was a disconnect between the ethical that I keep talking about and the legal or the technical. And exegetes got obsessed with formal correctness, with legalism, with seeking the exact time of the waiting period, the exact time when, with all these technical details, and forgot to link it always with what's the ethical intent behind it, what's God's intent behind it. And that's how it got more complicated with jurisprudence and with the juristic discourse, particularly, not just the tafsir. And again, naturally, a natural fourth consequence of that is the patriarchal assumptions of their ages took over. The patriarchal lens in looking at the verses and at the Quran governed the interpretations, governed the discourse, and it was allowed to take over. And that's what, particularly, of course, in the gender verses and in the verses about men and women, and about marriage and divorce, assumptions about men's superiority, about men's authority, about men's prerogative to control, about the lesser stature of women. These were all taken for granted, so to speak, cultural assumptions of the age. And this was allowed to govern how they looked at the Quran and the kind of knowledge, as Asma was saying, they produced, without women's perspective, without Muslimat's perspective, right? The Quran is for women and men. Until we reach the point where we have a conception of marriage, particularly in the juristic discourse, and it's a very explicit definition of marriage, that it's another form of slavery, or it is indeed a contract of provision in exchange for sexual access, in exchange for obedience and legal sexual access. And by the time you reach there, for us, for women Muslimat, you look at the juristic and the classical medieval definition or description of marriage, and you say, where did they get that from? It's not in the Quran. Where did they get it from? So yeah, so we'll end with that.
Thank you, Omaima, for outlining this gap so clearly and showing how this lack of consistent and comprehensive ethical outlook allowed patriarchal culture to dominate the interpretive discourse around gender issues in the Quran. Mulki, in addressing these gaps, you are developing this new holistic methodology, and we understand it is still a work in progress. Can you please briefly share with us what are the different dimensions of your new reading?
Yes, certainly. The first very important dimension to it, and it's also a premise. We are working from the premise that the Quran has a coherent ethical worldview and central ethical principles that are the guiding framework for the process of deriving norms, laws. But although it's a premise, it's a sort of like a hypothesis that we also want to make explicit. It's an objective, like we are assuming this is our assumption, it's our hypothesis, but part of our work also to make explicit that ethical worldview. And this is something that others have been interested in, traditional scholars, not so systematically, and a lot of modern scholars now realize the importance of that. Because we believe that it has this ethical worldview and that we're trying to also investigate, we think perhaps the best way to read it is thematically. What does it have to say about marriage and different aspects of family life, about relationship with other communities and so on? So what happens if you read the Quran thematically? How does that help you get at that ethical worldview? And that leads us to the importance when you read it thematically. It means you also pay attention to how certain parts of the Quran speak to other parts of the Quran, which is what we call the tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, and also this is something that has been done and is done now. And this takes, and it's very relevant to the thematic approach. Of course, it means you have to see how the different parts speak to each other, and as part of that, to pay very close attention to key terms. So if we're working on marriage, what does it mean that marriage sometimes is described as mithaq, covenant, and mithaq ghaliz, a very important and solemn covenant, but mithaq is also used in other parts of the Quran. What's the linkages? So paying attention to key terms that has to do with the theme we're working on, but also paying attention to what we call the ethical directives. These ethical terms that recur in the Quran and are not haphazard at all, and where they occur in the verse, in every unit of the verse, and as a thematic whole as well, whether it's taqwa, whether it's ma'ruf, whether it's ihsan, afu, fadl, and so on, and how it's always and taken back to the relationship between al-insan, the worshipper, the seeker, and the creator, Allah. Another important element of our methodology is paying a very close attention to the historicity of the Quran, the historical dimensions of the Quran. What does it mean that the Quran was revealed in 7th century Arabia? How do we read the verses that are grounded in 7th century Arabia? And the idea behind this is not to say, okay, these verses are not relevant to us and this is about 7th century Arabia, but because we are interested in uncovering the Quranic ethics, we're interested in these historical verses as well. What is the ethical intent behind it, and how is that relevant to us, and how is it relevant to different contexts? And because of these different dimensions, and because of our starting point and our goal of an ethical reading, of uncovering the Quran's ethical worldview, it makes very much sense that we adopt a holistic approach, an approach that pays attention to the historical and the universal, to the ethical and the normative, pays attention to the linguistic aspect, and to the intertextual approach as well.
Thank you very much, Mulki, for sharing with us very briefly a deep work that is still in progress, and we are very much looking forward to reading your paper and perhaps also, inshallah, a book, why not? Asma, can you please share with us an example of how this holistic, ethically oriented reading can be applied to a specific verse? Asma?
Yes, Sarah.
We can hear you.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, Sarah. This is a good example of there is a good example of this feminist, holistic, and ethical reading that we can apply in the verse 1 of Surah An-Nisa. This is the first ayah of Surah An-Nisa, one of the longest surahs in the Quran. the denomination of this word as Nisa, women, it's not a coincidence, you know, because it's here it's important to highlight this denomination, because this ayah is a surah which is mostly talking about instruction, mainly to men, about the protection and care for women and widow orphans and female orphans. So because of all these people were the oppressed of the oppressed in the Arabic text.
It seems that Asma is facing some difficulties. Please bear with us with the internet difficulties. We will just try to get Asma back.
Hello?
Hello, Asma, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm sorry, I have a bad connection this morning. I don't know why.
It's all right, no worries. Thank you, Asma. Yes.
So yes, so okay, so I was in the, you know, this importance of this surah, because all about the oppressed, you know, as a woman, no? I have two dimensions in this ayah, a global about human equality and the specific equality between man and woman. So we have many keys in this ayah which are very, very important. Are you hearing me?
Yes, very well.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear
okay.
you.
Yeah, so we have many keys concepts here. The first one is nafs al-wahida, one self, soul or one essence. You have the concept of zawjuha, which equal pair or mate. You have the concept of taqwa, it's a global and inclusive moral concept. You have the concept of the key concept of arham, which is the plural of rahm, webs. And so the ayah, in the ayah we have many points. The first begin very strongly suggest of you know, universality, because the ayah is in order to all human, all people, ya ayyuhan nas. The second point is the importance of taqwa, which happens twice in this same ayah. This is particularly important because taqwa involves many meanings. It's a complex concept, and we can't reduce it only to fervent devotion or fear from God. Taqwa is an ethical concept that includes many other ethical values, as for example, wealth. You know, khayr az-zadi taqwa, the best of taqwa. It's to forgiveness. وَإِن تَعْفُوا أَقْرَبْ لِلتَّقْوَى. Forgiveness is closer to taqwa. It's linked to solidarity. وتعاونوا على البر والتقوى. You have to cooperate on virtue and taqwa. It's linked to justice. وعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى. To be just is closer to taqwa. It's also, you know, closer to moral interiority. ولباس التقوى ذلك خير. The dress of taqwa is the best one. Is also linked to dignity. أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. The most virtuous for God is the one who has taqwa. So here is an example of an intertextual reading. It was already a methodology used by some scholar in other topics, as Mulki said, Al-Qur'an yufassiru ba'dahu al-ba'd. The Qur'an explain each other. The third point is the heart of this ayah. It's the nafs al-wahida. This is the central concept of this ayah, which means the essence on one common source of human being created from this one same essence. So God creates the all humanity from this unique source. The fourth point is the zawjuha, the mate, opener. God created from the original source, you know, nafs al-wahida, its part, zawjuha, its mark that the partner is frequently traduced or interpreted as Eve or as a woman, which is absolutely wrong. We can also see that the word nafs is feminine in Arabic, while the mate, zawjuha, is masculine. So we can see this symbolic link as or as a reciprocity, if you want, in human relationship without hierarchy or any categorization. The fifth point is from we have from these two parts of the couple, you know, the couple, nafs wahida and this partner. God created man and woman, batta minhuma rijalan kathiran wa nisa'an. And finally, the last point is about arham, which is wombs, which is the plural of rahm, the matrix, the maternal womb. And the verse ends by highlighting taqwa for a second time, but with reference to arham. So it means compassion in family relation through the feminine expression of arham. So it is very important to remember that the Quran links the human creation to nafs al-wahida wa zawjuha, to the womb, in three different verses. This one, the first one of Nisa, but also in Surah Al-An'am, in the context of pregnancy, حملت حملا خفيفا, a light burden, and in other verse in Al-Zumar, in other surah, when he said يخلقكم في بطون أمهاتكم خلق بعد خلق, he created. So we see the connection between the human creation from nafs al-wahida and the arham works, and arhams come from rahma, and we see the deep link between the creator, whose name is coming from the word mercy, you know, rahma. He's the Rahman Rahim. Arham works are source of life. So rahma is linked to paternity and maternal attribute, and as Ibn Arabi said, so its existence. It's also important here to know that we don't find in this verse, in any other Quranic verse, the smallest connotation that Adam is the nafs wahida, you know, the first human being, or male human being. And we don't find any reference to the secondary or marginal creation of Eve, whose name is not mentioned in the Quran anywhere. And there is also no word about woman being created from Adam rib, as we said in some hadith. The Quran does not represent any hierarchical or ordered view of man and woman. So there is no discrimination, no superiority from one sex over and or one person over another person. So all the ayat is about, finally, the equal human creation, source, wahida, the equal creation of man and woman with this universal diversity and human multiplicity. And all this is deeply linked to two important ethical values: taqwa as God veneration, but also at the core of justice, arham as the feminine expression of compassion in the name of God. So this is a very good example of an ayah present a central, ontological, holistic, and ethical framework of both universal and gender equality. It's one of the most important verses about the full humanity of men and women.
Thank you very much, Asma, for a very clear application of your methodology. And we can see how through your approach, the ethical goals of this Quranic worldview are not trapped in the historicity or social construction of the verse, but rather it's really the ontological equality between all human beings that becomes the heart of the message. The Quran is a living text, and our relationship to this text is dynamic. It changes throughout our life experiences. How would you define your relationship with the Quran? What were the verses that you found most challenging, and what were the ones that were uplifting and guiding you throughout this journey? Omaima, would you like to start?
Yes. You know, for all of us, you know, the Quran is a light, and it is such a solace, a needed solace in this difficult life. It really is. And when personally, when I read it most of the time I feel it directly speaks to me. Subhanallah, there are many verses, despite the fact that they may be very grounded in the historical occasion of the verse, for instance, or part of a bigger narrative. But it's like some verses have these two sides, the historical contextual side, but then they just emit universal truths, or truths about the human condition, or about human experience, or about women's experience, by the way, the verses on pregnancy and motherhood. So it's very close. It's a text that can be very close and speaks to me directly most of the time. You know, most of the verses that cultivate this sense of intimacy and reciprocity between us as believers and the divine and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The many verses that tells us that God is near, that God knows what's in our hearts. هو عليم بذات الصدور. هو أعلم بكم. I was reading that verse the other day. هو أعلم بكم. He knows you best. How true. How very, very true. Or this reciprocity. هل جزاء الإحسان إلا الإحسان. Goodness is His own reward. God gives you goodness so that you give Him back goodness. أحسن كما أحسن الله إليك. Do goodness as God grant you goodness. So all these verses are very, very touching and needed. The verses that have Asma al-Husna, that have God's beautiful names, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Ar-Ra'uf, Al-Latif, Al-Wadud, Al-Kareem. These are everywhere, and when you read it, you feel it tugs at your heart. One aspect that specifically also speaks to me is the aesthetics of Quranic textuality. That also I respond to it very much. The metaphors, the structures of language, the repetitions, the echoes, the reverberations all over the text. It's like responding to a work of art. And as we said, we need the dabbur, the reflection, the mind, and also the heart. And you need an innate sense of morality and of beauty. Challenging verses, of course, there are challenging verses that makes you stop and think and maybe feel a little bit uncomfortable. But, you know, the verses that seem to prioritize men, that seem to give men privilege over women, you know, concepts like, or terms like qawama, or like daraja in Al-Baqarah 228, or even daraba. You know, some of these things will make any believer stop and think. But then you learn how to resolve them eventually through that journey, that difficult journey that Asma was talking about, the journey of tadabbur and reading and rereading and studying and understanding Qur'an's logic and Qur'an's moral world. So you put that in the context of the whole of that comprehensive moral world of the Qur'an. And you learn to differentiate between patriarchal and social and cultural constructions of these concepts, how these concepts like qawama or daraja were blown way out of proportion, out of importance even by Quranic standards, while other verses have been just ignored or not looked at. So you learn to differentiate between that, and you learn discernment also, what Mulki mentions, and this is a duty for all Muslims, particularly Muslimat.
Thank you, Omaima, for this enlightening response. A text that is very close and that cultivates a beautiful intimacy between us and Allah. But also, as you rightly pointed out, when you face challenging interpretations, it's important to learn how to stop, reflect, and separate the context, the social construction, from what we feel in our heart is just. Asma, how would you define this relationship with the Quranic text?
I can define my relationship with the Quran as a relation of love, passion, but also reason, you know. because I had always this intensely need of rationality and spirituality at the same time, because it's question of harmony between the intellect and faith and reason. And for the Quran, you know, itself, heart and aql, al-qalb wal-aql, go together. So they have the same meaning. There is a beautiful link between al-aql wal-qalb, reason and you know, and heart, in the beautiful ayah, which is say, أَفَلَمْ يَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَتَكُونُ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا. Have they not traveled through the earth and have hearts by which to reason? So the most challenging verse was for me maybe the verse for the verse of you know as Qiwama in Surah 34 and in verse 34 Surah Nisa, because when you read it for the first time, you feel like you have a gender hierarchy, and because the majority of classic mufassirun interpreted it as you know, the main verse that supports the priority, the authority, and the domination of all men over all women. But in fact, when you after many research, when you go deeply in this holistic and ethical vision approach of the Quran, you see that Qiwama, you can name it Qima al-Khassa because it's specific to the family, is about men providing their wives bima anfaqu, which is so banal, you know, over time and context. It's not about power or honorability, but about responsibility. So a rereading of this ayah with a holistic, intertextual, and ethical-oriented approach show us that there is other main verses which are more important also, and so egalitarian, and which have never been evaluated in the traditional and classical tafsir. As, for example, other verses which use the same concept of qiwama, and where men and women are both concerned in the social public space. It's mean the qiwama al-amma, as we see it in two other verses, for example, in Surah Nisa and in Surah Al-Ma'idah, when God said, "Kunu qawwamina bil-qist wa bil-adl," stand out firmly for justice and justice. So in both verses, men and women are ordered to be in charge of and to stand up for justice. So we have the same concept of qiwama al-qawamun in the verse, and with this holistic reading, so qiwama in the verse 34, it can absolutely not be read as male superiority, but rather as a responsibility to do justice, even in the case of providing wives. There is another forgotten verse, which is for me a very, completely egalitarian. It's the verse about wilaya. المؤمنون والمؤمنات بعضهم أولياء بعض يأمرون بالمعروف وينهون عن المنكر. And the believing women are allies one of one another. They enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. This is a Quranic injection for an egalitarian situation of men and women in the social and political life. This verse is about social partnership. And so this is, it's about social partnership and action in support of the common good, yani ma'ruf, and women. But unfortunately, we don't find this within the tafsir. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma. Thank you for reminding us first how fundamental it is to find balance between heart and reason, and how your relationship is constantly seeking this harmony between the qalb and the aql. But also that in doing so, when you face challenging verses like the verse 434 on Qawama, there are ways, to uncover this ethical intent, and how you showed it very well, one that is seeking justice. Mulki, could you share with us how this experience with reading the Quranic text is unfolding for you?
Well, for me, again, there's an experiential, spiritual dimension to it as well as an intellectual. So if I start with the experiential one, this is a book and a revelation that I grew up with, and I first started it, studying it and memorizing it before I even went to school. Not all of it, but some of it. And that was when I was very little, before I moved to Egypt, where I grew up. And I remember, and this is a lifetime ago, so those of you who are young will not relate to this, or maybe. So I remember we had a tablet and we used to write the Quran on it with charcoal. This was in Mogadishu in Somalia, and I was very proud of my tablet. And then when I moved to Egypt and I studied it there, I love its musicality. I love listening to it. I see it as a source of ethics. So I relate very much to the message of the Quran, what it teaches us ethically. So when we are facing a difficult issue, my sisters and I will remind each other, and we say, وَالْقَازِمِينَ الْغَيْظَ وَالْعَافِينَ عَنِ النَّاسِ وَاللَّهُ يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. You know, those who hold their anger, those who do good and beautiful. I say, I have in my office, the verse said, خَيْرُ الزَّادِ التَّقْوَى. The best provision, the best food, the best sustenance is taqwa, God presence, God consciousness. أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبُ. I also, with God's remembrance, with God's words, the heart is comforted. And one of my famous, I also like Surah Luqman, where it teaches us to not to be arrogant, not to walk in this earth being arrogant and full of ourselves, but to be self-reflective. I like how God describes the ulama, those who seek knowledge, as those who are have humility. So I really relate to the book as a source of ethics, but it's not a static by any means relationship. Sometimes when I listen to it, I feel it's really speaking to me, and other times I'm not so open, and I struggle with it. Now the intellectual part of it is very, very important also. I really appreciate that I'm studying. I get to teach it. I get to teach it with other scholars. I get to learn about it from non-Muslim and Muslim scholars, and that's very helpful for me. So when I read knowledge about the Quran and then go back to the Quran, it's really helpful. And I want to note a group of women scholars that have been for me very, very influential in how I read the Quran and learn it. So when I read Mina Wadood's work and the concept of Tawheed, and I go back to the Quran, it really gives me more insight to read the Quran. When I read Saadia Sheikh's work about Sufism and I go back to the Quran, it makes a difference. And same with Omaima and Asma's work, also with Niveen Rida and how their work on the structure of the Quran and what that teaches us about how to read the Quran and arrive at its meaning. The Egyptian scholar Amani Saleh, who has interesting and very insightful knowledge about the Quran. So that intellectual aspect of it, also that knowledge produced about the Quran, is really helpful, particularly by these women scholars.
Thank you very much, Mulki. You have a beautiful love relationship with the Quran, and like all the love relationships, it's not static, it needs nurturing. It's a never-ending process of seeking and understanding. It's also important to recognize the...
Sarah, can I add something? Sorry that I forgot. Yeah. So like because of the challenging ones, they're the usual ones that Omaima and Asma related to, but one that often I find challenging is the ones about the rituals, and they are addressed to men. So إذا لامستم النساء, you know, so go do this and this and that. And I said, well, I'm the addressee also. These verses about the rituals and teachings are also addressed to me. What about that? And of course, this is, as we know, a question raised even by by early Muslim women, and one of the Prophet's wives, Salama. So this is some of the verses that gets me to think also as well. Go ahead.
And when you face these challenging verses, Mulki, what is your way out?
I mean, it's really helping that I'm reading it ethically, that I'm doing this kind of work, that I have that space to reflect, to think, not to shy away from the challenging questions, not to be apologetic, but to be rigorous, you know, to hear each other. And Omaima and Asma would tell you we have a lot of discussions about this, and really reading it holistically helps. And then something that Asma Barlas also wrote, I found it very helpful. The idea is also to search for, the Quran has multiple meanings, she calls it the polysemic, you know. So these multiple meanings are very important to recognize, but at the same time, it doesn't mean it's relative and all meanings are the same, you know. So I'm now more invested in the process itself, rather being so much worried about there's one correct meaning, right?
Thank you, Mulki. And it is very important to recognize that this process of searching a meaning, it's important, a meaning that does justice to our understanding of what God is about, a meaning that is just and that is compassionate. This year we are experiencing a very special Ramadan. The health crisis is shattering our lives and creates many anxieties about the future and meaning of life. We are reminded of how fragile life can be, while at the same time becoming increasingly aware of the existing structural inequalities and injustices. Omaima, what does the Quran teach us to guide us through these kind of hardships?
Yes, the Quran, as we have been saying, acknowledges human weakness, acknowledges human fear and anxiety. And so that's a signal to us that it's okay to feel that kind of anxiety, that fear of illness, of loss. But there's also the path for healing, the path to seek God as a refuge and to seek the Quran as a refuge, to try to struggle with these feelings of anxiety. The Quranic expression of sharh al-sadr, Allahumma shrah li sadri, or alam nashrah laka sadrak. It's a very beautiful expression, expansion of your chest. Because when you're depressed, when you're anxious, when you're afraid, you really feel constricted in your chest, and you are looking forward for that. You seek that kind of expansion and the ease of burden and the lifting of hardships. So hardships are there. God talks about ibtila. These are times of ibtila, times of trials and tests. How are we going to be patient about it? How are we going to strive to lift our burdens? How are we going to reflect on the meaning of this, on the meaning of suffering and hardship? The Quran tells us in a verse, وَظَنَّ أَهْلُهَا أَنَّهُمْ قَادِرُونَ عَلَيْهَا. When people think that they have gained mastery over existence, maybe this is the time to think, have we really gained mastery over existence, or have we ruined our environment? Have we abused the resources of the planet? Really, in plain terms, what did we do wrong? That humanity did many things wrong in general. And but we're also learning that the common humanity of facing one danger. And for the first time, when I think about this, for the first time, this is a danger that's facing all humanity at the same time. It's not like a war here or a flood there, or it is one danger for all humanity. And everything else, subhanAllah, for the past few months have become suddenly unimportant. All aspects of life or existence on this planet have become unimportant in comparison to all of humanity seeking to be saved, to be delivered from this unseen enemy all of a sudden, right? So there are a lot of lessons from this crisis. And how do we fix it? A lot of lessons, and inshallah we'll be able to go faster, inshallah. Just one more thing about common humanity and the equality in this. I was talking about we all have been made equal in the face of this danger, to remind us of the inequalities, of the so many inequalities of our own making that humanity has created inequalities in race, in gender, in class, between nations, between North and South. This is a time to remember these kind of inequalities that we have created.
Thank you. Thank you, Omaima, for reminding us that this crisis is a chance to think about what human beings have been doing to our planet, but also to each other. It forces us to be humble, reflect on our responsibilities. And thank you for reminding us that the Quran acknowledges our weaknesses, but at the same time, it gives us the path towards healing. Asma, how is the Quran reminding us of our Khalifa mission, our shared responsibility as human beings to be more sensitive to our environments? Asma, can you hear us? We can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself. Great. Thank you.
I'm sorry. I think that this Ramadan is, in time of this global pandemic, is an exceptional, things, some traditions, and new approach of our understanding of fasting. It can be a beautiful time to live the spiritual month as it should be. In simplicity, sobriety, kind of detachment from all materialism. And the spiritual, retreat, as the Prophet ﷺ did it alone in the deep silence in the Mount of Hira. I think that world pandemic, Allah is showing us His ayats in the cosmos and within ourselves, as He said, نريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق من ربك. So we will show them our signs in the horizon and themselves until it becomes clear for them that is the God. So maybe we should also try to have a deep reflection on our modern way of life and ecological world, because it's our first responsibility as Khalifa. And our mission as men and women is to take care about this creation. And this is the meaning of Khilafah and Amana. So in this special time of this global pandemic, we all know that we have failed. We have failed in this mission as Muslim and as human. So because we have not been able to read Ayatullah, God's ayat in the sky, in the earth, in the samawati wal ard, in the mountains, in our relationship with the animals, with nature, with all the creation of Allah, with Khalq Allah. So it's time to return, maybe to reconnect to what is essential in our life and in our relationship with God and its creation. This crisis is a special reminding from God, maybe a transcendental sign which challenges us about our excess, about failing, about our egocentrism and arrogance, towards nature, earth, and so on. And because according to the Quran, breaking the harmony of the creation is an act of corruption. And the Quran call it fasad, الذين يفسدون في الأرض. So we must recognize that we have done such fasad, breaking this natural balance, nature, of our planet. So unfortunately, all this cosmic ecologic vision of the Quran is absent in most of our Islamic discourse now and concern today. So because we have reduced Islam from its cosmic vision to a strictly rigorist and legalist religion. So we need also to recognize that we forget a very important another dimension. It's the human dimension of the Quranic message. This crisis, maybe it's an opportunity to return to an important message of the human solidarity and a shared humanity, al-mushtarak al-insani in the Quran. Because that is attacking all humanity without religion or ethnical distinction. So, and the Quran is a beautiful ethical recalling us about our common humanity despite our diversity.
Thank you, Asma. for reminding us that this crisis is an ayah from Allah, a divine sign to challenge our human arrogance towards nature, and also a lesson of humility that pushes us to reconcile ourselves with this idea of nafs al-wahida, to be aware of the fact that we share a common humanity. Mulki, what is your reflection, your tadabbur on the Quran leading you to when you think about these times of hardship?
Well, first of all, I want to pray for those we all as human beings lost to this pandemic. May Allah's blessing be on them and comfort their loved ones. And I think these are very difficult times, very trying times, but I also allows us to reflect, to do tadabbur. And a couple of things that really resonate with me from the Quran because of this pandemic is the Quran affirms very much how we come from one origin, and then we are different. We have different shara'i', different paths. So affirms always the commonality and the difference, and both as part of this harmonious order of God, right? But I think what happened now is often difference has taken over. And there's a lot of exclusion, multiple layers of exclusion, whether it's based on gender, whether it's based on race, economics, definitely, wealth, also ideology. And I think perhaps it behooves us, maybe we take these very difficult times. It's affecting everybody, nobody's spared. This reminds us that we're all in this together. We come from one origin, but it reminds us also we don't need to erase our difference. Difference is part of the harmonious world, universe, the order that. So how can we reach out to one another and and share a common good of doing the al-adl and the justice, which is justice and ihsan, and get beyond binaries. So as Muslims, stop only praying for Muslims and reach out for everybody. Also, as religious people, stop looking down on people who are not religious, and vice versa. Those who are not religious or don't take that path, have a condescending approach towards those who are religious and think, oh, that's all kinds of binaries. Could we take this opportunity, this very painful time, to see how we can cherish and learn from our difference, and without erasing it, but at the same time really hang on and click to what Asma was saying, al-mushtarak al-insani, that it's this earth is all for us, the universe, and that the idea of equality and justice is for all of us. And the Quran always affirms it's a message of reform. From the get-go, it tries to reform human beings' ways of doing things, of relating to each other, and the reform particularly for those who are most vulnerable, the oppressed. So what can we learn? Can we go back to that very core Quranic message about how we can stand up for the vulnerable, for the oppressed, from all kinds, whether it's on economic base or on a gender base or religion base. So I think these are the lessons that really resonate with me because of these difficult times.
Thank you so much, Mulki. It's important to remind ourselves of how the Quran is coming with this reform trajectory, focusing on those who are oppressed. You're opening actually a number of ethical and political questions for Muslims, and we need to reflect to what extent are we blinded by our privileges and unreceptive to the oppressed and marginalized groups among us, and where are we at in our collective responsibility to stand against these inequalities and injustices. So this is something to ponder on while we are moving forward. Thank you so much, Mulki, Omaima, and Asma, for this illuminating conversation. Everybody on this webinar have now gotten a flavor of the empowering and healing type of reading that could be applied to the Quran. I want to thank all our attendees for their constructive and on-point questions. Our colleagues Suri and Alex tried to cluster them so that the speakers can answer the questions at a time. So I will start with Omaima, if that's all right with you, with two questions that are related to your interpretation of the verse 434, and another question that is related to this one: what exactly is the daraja that men have over women in the Quran. So the verse from Surah Al-Baqarah. And another third related question, how would you interpret the term beat them, adribuhunna, in the same verse 434?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. The first question was about qiwama specifically, or about the verse 434. You know, first of all, I would like to refer everyone to Musawah's book, Men in Charge, with two important chapters, one chapter by Asma Lamrabet and another one by me. The whole book, of course, is about particularly this concept of qiwama, but the two chapters by Asma and myself are about the Quranic discourse on that, or on that concept, and the difference between how it was constructed as authority, as control, and it is much less than that. It is simply a divine injunction at a time of women's economic disempowerment. It's a divine injunction for men to spend, to provide for women. It's an economic, it began being simply an economic injunction, or even caring for women. It acquired the aspect of authority and power and control throughout the exegetical, the interpretive discourse. But if you look, we have to give a very short answer. Go read the book, go read the two chapters. Qiwama is mentioned in three other verses, three other verses, to mean standing up for justice. So it means treating women in this verse, simply it's treating women with justice. It has nothing to do with authority and control. This is one of the things. There are other things that you can see. The daraja in Al-Baqarah, verse 228, again, many interpret. Of course, the mainstream of interpreters made that link. This is one of the very, very rare times when they make links between verses. But in this one, they made the link between daraja and the qiwama in 434, although they're not related at all. So they do exactly the opposite of what they're supposed to do. When they're not supposed to relate things, they do. But they read this daraja as qiwama, and it's not. The context of the verse itself was about divorce, was about, again, an injunction from God subhanahu wa ta'ala to both men and women not to hurt each other in the process of divorce, not to lie, to be magnanimous, to be ethical. And the daraja, that the degree came, it's either the divorce, it's either the legal right of divorce held by men. That seems to be the general interpretation accepted. But then there is another interpretation that hasn't attracted much attention by Tabari, the first of the exegetes in the 10th century. He interprets it as that degree, that extra degree of magnanimity, that extra degree of effort, of ethical effort that men are asked to do. So it's an acquired thing. It's not an innate extra degree of privilege that men are born with. No, this is a divine recommendation, so to speak, to men to acquire that extra degree of doing the right thing in a context when men were violent and were doing a huge injustice to women in the context of divorce. Again, let's go back to the context of the verse. So many things to be saying about these concepts or these words. You don't take one word out of the context of the verse, of the passage, of the surah, of the whole Quran, and say, okay, here it is, daraja or qiwama. This is the thing. The beating verse, again, many interpretations. Maybe there's not time to go into this now, but there are two interpretations now from that it could mean just going away, separating from the women, not striking. There's another interpretation that links it with al-had, that links it with the had for zina or for sexual misconduct, and that it's not an order for husbands, but it's an order for the community, for the legal community. It's very hard to go through all the dimensions of this verse. I know this is the verse that is challenging for all of us, but I want everyone to be sure that it is definitely not giving the order to husbands or the license to husbands to strike their wives. God is too compassionate. This cannot be right. This cannot be right. Yes.
Of course. Thank you, Omaima. And our colleagues also in the chat room are sharing links to the relevant publications and work that our speakers are mentioning. Mulki, I would like now to address two questions to you. One from our friend Hatun, who asked about Muhammad Arkoun, who has written extensively about the Quran and critiqued the tradition of interpretation and its lack of historicity. She says she also knows that before his death, Musawah had contact and meetings with him. How did Musawah benefit or interact with what he had to say about reference to gender in the Quran? The second question is about ma malakat aymanukum. What is your definition or your interpretation of this term, and how does this apply to our lives today?
Okay. Thank you for the questions, and I want the panelists also to jump in, and perhaps maybe for the first one, I don't think either three of us can answer that. I am familiar with Muhammad Arkoun's work, of course, but I don't know his contact with Musawah and his engagements with Musawah. That was probably before my time, so I will not be able to address that, unfortunately, but I think he has a lot of contribution, has made a lot of contribution to Islamic reformist thought, definitely. So, so I'm sorry, Hatun, I'm unable to address that, but I'd be happy to get back to you when I found out from my other colleagues at Musawah who have insight on that. Ma malakat aymanikum. So I haven't, we've studied this as part of the book chapter that Asma and Omaima and I are working on now. It's not something that we specifically focused on because we are, you know, we are studying it. I mean, what I mean to say is that it's not the central focus of the chapter, because the focus is marriage as a theme and how do you read the Quranic ethical worldview. And I personally, in the work that I've done, mostly I've done legal Islam. I worked on Islamic jurisprudence and Muslim family laws, and then I've been working with Omaima for the past 5 years on the Quranic hermeneutics with regard to divorce verses. So what I'm gonna say is in the context of the work of this chapter that I'm doing with Omaima and Asma, and generally some ideas from me, but I definitely want to invite Asma and Omaima to jump in, please, so that we can address it adequately. So I think in the context of this chapter that we're working on, this part is particularly relevant to the historical dimension of our methodology, you know, so that it's clearly it addresses a particular context where you had a certain kinds of sexual relationships that were sanctioned. Slavery was sanctioned, but the Quran definitely was, if one reads it again holistically, as we said, and intertextually and thematically, you can see that there was definitely a goal towards abolishing it and eliminating it. But it's also a good example of the historical dimension of the Quran, that it's revealed in a text, in a context where people had slaves, and the Quran encourages to abolish it, but acknowledges it. It acknowledges it and regulates it. It doesn't come out straight out and say no, definitely not. And this is an example where you can deal ethically with it. And of course, it's one of the issues that raises an ethical conundrum for us today. and I think it brings up the issue of the literal meaning versus the ethical meaning, the importance of that, So do you take it something that literally has to apply to every context, and then, okay, we should have malakat aymanikum as long as we regulate it, and as long as we have an ethical framework that guides this relationship between a man and his slave, is that acceptable within the Quranic ethics? I would venture and say definitely no. But then, what do you do with that verse? And as we know, also in the historical traditional sources, there was also the question of this woman and message of the Quran. But it's definitely a tension that I recognize, and we're not shying away from it. And Omaima and Asma, please, if you have insights or clarifications that you want to add to that.
Do you want to add any insight on?
Yeah, can I add something very quickly about that? Slavery was there when the Quran descended, so it has always been a part of human history. When the Quran, just to that we remember it, the Quran didn't institute it, or Islam didn't institute it. It was there. And then even by the way, and the Malakat Aymanakum, we recognize it as a historical institution, just like the jizya. It's okay to say that there are certain things that were historical and they don't exist now anymore. But even in the verses about Malakat Aymanakum, and I know Mulki and Asma, we talked about this in some of the things we're reading. Even when you look deeply at these verses, it's the Quran never sanctions illegal sexual relations with concubines. It's the order, if you look at the verses very carefully, is to marry from them, as opposed to free. So there were free women, yes, and there were slaves, and the order is to marry from the slaves, not to have illegal sexual relations with them, right, Asma? Yeah. This is just one detail that I wanted to throw in.
Asma, do you have something to add to that?
No, we have discussed this in our work, and Omaima have into this is really a very historical context, and we have to read it like that. But the difference, Omaima said that the Quran intend to protect this woman. This is the more important, that the finality is, and the objective, the maqasid, is to protect, because they were really oppressed. And the thing I understood from the Quran is that they have the right to be married. It's not sexual freedom. You can have forward as like that. No, I don't think, because there is a framework, there is a mithaq, there is a nikah, there is a zwaj for them, and this is all.
But yes, and I would also add that in order to follow the moral trajectory that the Quran sets in motion, and this is something that many Muslim scholars have written about, modern scholars, like Khalid Abu Fadl and others, and Mina Wadud and Omaima and Asma, I would say that also I would argue that it's not simply by the Quran's logic. If we agree on that premise that the Quran sets a moral trajectory in motion, by the Quran's logic itself, it's not simply enough to say, oh, okay, I can have a female slave, but I'm going to treat her ethically and I'm going to marry her. That I think we could also argue, and maybe people will disagree with us, but by the Quran's logic, that no, slavery, period, is against the Qur'an's ethics, you know, even if you are treating your slave ethically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And thank you for clarifying this, Mulki. And I think it's very important to sometimes clarify and be straightforward with this kind of statements. Now I would like to address 3 questions to Asma. One is related to how does this ethical outlook and faith-based feminism differ from the Western women's movement? And what is the place of reason in this Islamic feminist interpretation? Another related question is the meaning of Muslim feminist and Islamic feminism, whether you think it's important to differentiate these terms or not. And a third question, how do you see this work moving forward in the future for our young people in the future?
Okay. We have to make the difference between in the feminism and all the movement of, there is first of all a feminism in plural. There is not a feminism. So when you are talking about Western women's movement as a feminism, as at, you know, I don't agree, because it's plural. So what does this ethical outlook, you know, differ from the Western movement? I think that we share many things. We share the universal principle, because there is in all these universal principle, and there is a models. So there is different models, because in the Western feminism there is one. You know, in Europe, you have, in France, you have many models of feminism. In States, in you know, in everywhere, there's a plural movement of feminism. And in the Arabic world or the Muslim world, also there is many movements, but we share universal principles. The universal principles are, you know, the gender equality, dignity, emancipation, freedom, the right to work, to be against all the discrimination. So this is very important. This is what we share. But the other thing, it's about strategy, about text. Apply French or American feminism in my country, in Morocco. So I have my context, I have my perspective as Moroccan and Muslim and Arabic woman. So I have to deal with my local patriarchal system. So this is the difference, but we have something to share. And what is the question is what the place of reason in this Islamic feminist, you know, it's the big place. It's in the heart of the Islamic or the feminism and Muslim feminism, because reason is everything, you know. And I think that our quest is a quest of, and it's a quest of justice for men and women. It's a question of justice for all the society. So this is for me the reason approach, you know, the reasonal approach. So the difference between the Muslim feminists and Islamic feminists, you know, personally, I don't make this difference. But there is some, you know, words and some feminists who say that Muslim feminists are these feminists who are not, you know, working on the sacred text. They are working on their culturally feminist, and they are working on the human rights and the universal human rights and other things. And Islamic feminist is new movement raised in the 18 and 19 after all the Islamic revolution, and working, you know, starting working on the text, on the sacred text. And so, but for me, I don't believe, because our goal maybe is the same. It's this principle universal, you know. So to have faith or not to have faith, it's your own person, your own business. It's between you and God. So the most important is the goal, is the finality, you know, and this universal principle. And the second question is how I see this work moving forward in the future. You know, I see that young people, you know, is waiting for us. Is waiting for us to give them the answers, because the problems that our religious institution and our ulama, and most of them, they didn't answer. They don't answer to them. They have no alternative to these young people. So this is very problematic, and it's not about you know, women also. Many young people, men who came and who sent me mails and who asked me about, you know, many things in the Quran. So there is a gap. There is, you know, like something, you know, there is the absence of you know, of answering to these two young people. And I see that they are going and they have this consciousness, you know, about, they are worrying that there is something monolithic and this ethical discourse of Islam.
Thank you.
So Sarah, can I add just something very quickly, Sarah?
Perhaps let's Asma finish her thoughts.
Sorry, okay.
I'm sorry, I thought she was...
Is there any other question? Another question, Sarah? No?
No, you didn't miss the third.
Okay.
Thank you. Mulki, you can add.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to add, I second what Asma said, but I just want to add that feminism, as we see it as a knowledge project within this project. And if it's a knowledge project, of course, reason is central. It's very central. Now, as for Islamic feminism, I just want to add something, and this is coming from my doing research on it. I see sometimes people talk all the time about Islamic feminists, but I think what's crucial about Islamic feminists, the way I understand it, is that it's a knowledge projects undertaken predominantly by Muslim women that are trying to do systematically two things: deconstruct patriarchal interpretations and reconstruct egalitarian interpretations, but working from within the tradition. And hence the word Islamic. Islamic, i.e. making an argument for gender equality on Islamic grounds and bridging feminist studies and religious studies together. So adopting feminism as also a theory of knowledge as a methodology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mulki. And actually, you're addressing some of the questions by this clarification. Because we're short on time, I will share with you one last question, and I'm addressing it to all three of you. How do contemporary male scholars of the Quran perceive your emancipatory and alternative interpretations of the challenging verses about gender relations? Who wants to start? Omaima?
Yes. Contemporary male scholars, how do they view this project in general, right? The Islamic feminist project that we're talking about. Very few are supportive. There are some male feminists, you know, who are supportive and who are fair, and who can see the problem and see what is the intent behind this project, as Mulki explained it. Unfortunately, the majority do not understand. There are many accusations to this project, and of course the hostility also comes specifically from religious institutions, because any institution is about power and is about authority. And it has been, you know, monopolized throughout the decades by male. These are male institutions, right? And they're about power and authority, you know, the authority of knowledge. So they do not look favorably most of the time on our efforts, and they, you know, there are accusations either of adopting a Western liberal agenda. I don't know why, just because we speak about justice and equality that are the core message, as we have been explaining and talking about from the Quran. Equality and justice and beauty and ethics are not a monopoly of the West. So that's one accusation. And another accusation is that we're not specialists. But really, the accusation of not being specialist is that you don't have the power, and will not allow you to have the power of the knowledge. In terms of not specialists, I'm not being modest, but we are learning. We all read and we all learn and we study. So we are making ourselves, inshallah, with the help of God, specialize in what we read. We read and we study. We take this very, very seriously. We engage the tradition, as Mulki is saying. So we're not just parachuting on the Quran or on this knowledge. So the problem is power and authority.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Omaima. Asma or Mulki, do you want to add?
Yes, I would like to add, but first,
yes. Go ahead, Mulki, if you want.
Yeah, I would say we want to recognize male scholars who are very supportive of this project. There are few, but very. We have the privilege of collaborating with a number of them in the projects that we've been working on. There's Muhsin Kadivar, a scholar at the Duke University from Iran. There's Shadab Rahmatullah from the University of Edinburgh. But Omaima is absolutely right. There are few. And I think we are in a kind of like in a way we are a misfit, not only by within vis-a-vis male scholars, but I would say misfit because, as Omaima said, traditional religious scholars say you are not specialists and you are doing gender, therefore this is from the West. Some people who are very skeptical about engaging with religion seriously and positively, but critically and rigorously, also question this. Also in Islamic studies, if you do gender, it's seen as, this is just activist project. It's not really knowledge. It's not really intellectual. Okay, whereas I see this as really bringing up very important questions for everybody, even if you're not working on gender, questions of authority, questions of hermeneutics, questions of ethics. So it's kind of like we are a misfit, but perhaps being a misfit is a good thing because it allows us not to be always self-reflective, to be humble, to keep doing the work very rigorously. And I think one thing that I really am grateful for is that the colleagues that I work with, we share general goals, but also we allow ourselves this space to be different. And we are different. And perhaps if you get to see when we work together, we have some differences and we air these differences and learn from them. We don't just, we're not just a choir singing the same song, as they say, Okay, Asma, your turn. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mulki.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. I totally agree and more true, but I want to say that there is a difference between the Western context and our context as Arabic Muslim context, because as Omaima said, our scholars are in general against our work. We have to be very clear, and I just have to recognize that there is a few here, for example in Morocco, that young scholar, not the traditionalist scholar, the young scholar who are working but it's very important to and there, some of them are as tragic classic and traditional scholars are very virulent because there is a fear of what is emancipation, what is woman, the concept of woman. So there is a big fear of the changing, the norm, changing the tradition. They and as Omaima said, they think they didn't read our work. They just saw the title, as feminism, as modern, as gender equality, and it's enough for them to say that it's Islam. So they don't. And the second thing that they do, they do there is a denial to the reality. They don't know the reality of the, you know, the people, of young people, of our sociological context. So they don't know what's happened. They are just, you know, in closed in their you know, citadel, I don't know how you say that, in their, you know, books of classical tafsir, and they don't want anything to change, because change for them is a danger, you know, it's very, very, very dangerous for them. What I want to also, as Omaima said, it's about power, and they are very afraid to lose that power. And this is, it was classical in all the, you know, the history of the Islamic civilization. But I still believe we are a minority, but we are a strong minority, and inshallah we will you know, we will success. You know why? Because we are sincere. We are believing in a very, very important and ethical concept in the Quran. We are believing in justice of Allah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asma, and what a beautiful way actually to close the webinar with this idea of power, and thank you for empowering us to reclaim these spaces with your work and insights. We apologize because there were so many questions that we didn't have time to answer, but you will see in the PowerPoint in the last slide our email, so please feel free to send us your further questions. We would like to close this webinar with a dua. It was very important for us to close a session on spiritual care with a prayer. The dua was developed by all four of us, and it is inspired by Quranic verses, and it's in Arabic, but you will be able to find the English translation in the PowerPoint, and I've been designated to read the dua. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللطيف الرؤوف القريب السميع المجيب الدعاء اللهم اجعلنا من أولي الألباب الذين يتدبرون في آياتك في كتبك وفي ملكوتك وفي أنفسنا اللهم اجعلنا من المتقين المقسطين العافين المحسنين اللهم ارزقنا البصير والصبر وحب الخير اللهم يا أرحم الراحمين ارفع عنا وعن البشرية مع هذا الوباء والبلاء وارزقنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا عليك توكلنا وإليك أنبنا وإليك المصير ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا يا أرحم الراحمين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Thank you everyone. Thank you so much for your time, for your questions. Thank you again, Mulki, Omaima, Asma, for your illuminating interventions and responses. Before you leave, can you all please respond to a poll? It's short, only 2 questions, and it's important for us to have your feedback. We will post a recap and the video of this webinar to the Musawah website, plus the resources mentioned by the speakers, so that you can share it with your friends, your relatives, and send us your feedback. May God fill your heart with light, and may we all remember to be kind to each other during these very difficult times. Thank you also to Suri and Alex and all our colleagues in Musawah for making this possible. And keep in touch with us through our Facebook page, through our website, and we will be more than happy to share with you our work. Assalamu alaikum.